a secluded village, Halloween was a time no one dared to take lightly. The villagers often spoke of a haunting decoration, a porcelain skull displayed in Mrs. Hua's antique shop. Many years ago, Mrs. Hua had heard a tale about a dark sorcerer who used the skull to imprison the souls of the dead in dark rituals. Anyone who possessed it on Halloween night would be drawn into a nightmare without end. Despite the warnings, a young girl named Lily, full of ambition, decided to buy the skull. She wanted to impress her friends at her Halloween party. When she brought it home, she felt a chill run down her spine. Ignoring her unease, Lily placed the skull on the table, decorating around it with pumpkins and fake spider webs. As the party progressed, laughter echoed everywhere. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere became increasingly tense. When the clock struck midnight, the skull began to emit whispering sounds. "Free me?" Lily panicked, feeling as if millions of eyes were staring at her. The next morning, she discovered a small piece of paper beneath the skull, which read, "The bearer will bear the curse." Her demeanor began to shift. Dark dreams haunted her, each night bringing nightmares filled with shadowy figures whispering for release. As Halloween approached, the whispering sounds in Lily's head grew clearer. She started seeing ghastly images in the mirror, twisted faces, eyes filled with torment. One night, she woke up at midnight to find the skull had vanished. The room was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the flickering light of her bedside lamp. As she stepped out of her room, a cold wind swept in, carrying the stench of decay. The walls seemed to murmur her name. "Lily, save us." She felt as if she were being watched, and her fear intensified. Finally, Halloween night arrived, and Lily couldn't shake her thoughts about the skull. She decided to host a party at her house, but the festive atmosphere quickly turned to dread. When the clock struck midnight, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Free me." In a panic, Lily saw the skull reappear on the table, its gaze seeming to consume everyone. The guests began to stagger, their eyes glazed over as grotesque spirits emerged from the skull, revealing themselves in nightmarish forms. "Free us!" Terrified, Lily realized these souls sought not only freedom but also to possess her body. In an instant, everything morphed into a nightmare. Guests screamed, their faces contorted in pain. She ran outside, but darkness enveloped the house. Shadows surrounded her, and a spirit with hollow eyes stood before her, whispering, "Save us, or no one will survive." In a final act of desperation, Lily grasped the skull and shouted, "I will free you." But when she smashed the skull to the ground, it did not shatter. Instead, it emitted blinding light. The souls howled, their faces twisting into grotesque shapes, filled with hatred. In that final moment, Lily felt the weight of the souls pressing down on her. She fell to the ground, and in that instant, a cold sensation spread from the skull into her body. When everything fell silent, Lily realized she had become one of those trapped souls, imprisoned in the skull, which had vanished, waiting for the next person brave enough to touch it. And from that day on, the tale of the skull lived on, haunting future generations as a warning for those who dared to challenge fate on Halloween night. After the horrifying events of Halloween night, the village returned to a semblance of peace. But the shadow of the skull lingered in the minds of the villagers. No one dared to speak of it, and the townspeople grew increasingly cautious as Halloween approached each year. However, a year later, a group of young friends moved to the village, including a girl named Emily, who had a fascination with exploring mysteries. They heard the stories about the skull from locals, and it piqued their interest. "We have to find that skull," Emily said, her eyes shining with excitement. "It might just be an urban legend." The group decided to search for the skull in Mrs. Hua's antique shop. As they entered, the atmosphere felt heavier, and the lights flickered as if something was amiss. Mrs. Hua, with her piercing gaze, warned them, "Do not touch the skull, it carries a curse." But Emily ignored her, eager to prove that it was just a tale meant to scare children. Eventually, they found the skull, still in its original spot, seemingly untouched by time. "It's beautiful," Emily said, reaching out to touch it. Immediately, a cold wind swept through, and the whispering voices began. "Free me." The group became frantic, but Emily remained determined. "We have to understand this," she pulled her friends closer. As they all touched the skull together, an unseen force enveloped them, and they felt themselves being drawn into another realm. Suddenly, they found themselves in a dark space, where tortured souls floated, crying and wailing. Emily realized that they had made a grave mistake. "We need to get out of here," she shouted. But as they tried to escape, a familiar figure appeared. Lily, the girl who had once owned the skull. Her face was filled with anguish, and her eyes glimmered with panic. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her voice weak. Emily tried to comfort her. "We'll help you." "No, you can't help me," Lily replied. "I've been trapped here since that night. This skull cannot be destroyed. It will forever hold the souls of those who dare to touch it." The young friends panicked as they realized they were not only facing the skull but also an eternal curse. As they struggled to escape, the skull began to glow, and the spirits reached out to them, trying to drag them into the darkness. Emily and her friends had to find a way to save Lily and themselves. In a decisive moment, they held hands facing the skull and together shouted, "We are not afraid. Free us." A blinding light erupted, driving back the darkness. The souls screamed, but they gradually retreated. As the light spread, everyone found themselves standing back in Mrs. Hua's antique shop, the skull still resting silently on the table. Lily turned back, hope shining in her eyes. "Thank you. But this skull will always exist. It will never stop seeking those who dare to touch it." Hearing this, the group left the shop, their hearts heavy with fear. They had survived, but the skull still haunted them. And as Halloween approached, they always felt an invisible gaze watching them, a reminder that horrors could return at any moment. The skull awaited in the shadows for those daring enough to challenge fate once more. After escaping the antique shop, the young friends thought they had evaded the skull's curse. However, haunting visions began to invade their daily lives. Emily frequently dreamed of the skull, with tormented souls screaming in the dark. These nightmares left her restless, and her fear grew. One evening, while reminiscing together, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, flinging open a window and carrying the whispering voice, "Free me." The friends exchanged terrified glances. They understood that the skull could not be left in the past. Emily resolved that they had to return to the antique shop once more. "We need to end this," she said, determination in her eyes. The group agreed, despite the lingering dread in their hearts. When they returned, Mrs. Hua was no longer there. The shop seemed abandoned, dusty and silent. The skull remained in its old place, but this time it emitted a faint, eerie light. "We have to destroy it," one of them suggested. Together they created a small ritual, holding hands around the skull. Emily closed her eyes and prayed for the souls to be set free. As they began to chant blessings, the skull began to tremble, and light exploded from it. But just then, a strong wind swept in, and the souls appeared around them, screaming in despair. "Why did you come back? We cannot be free." The spirits swirled, their faces contorted in anguish. Emily didn't back down. "We won't let you suffer anymore," she shouted, and the strength within her spread to the others. They all cried out, "Free these souls!" Suddenly, an invisible force filled the space, and the skull burst into a brilliant light. The souls began to rise, the light freeing them from their torment. A sense of peace enveloped the space. As everything settled, the group realized that the skull was no more, but an odd sensation lingered in the air, like a reminder of what they had endured. Emily and her friends walked out of the shop, knowing they had freed the souls, but the specter of the skull still existed in their memories. They understood that even though the skull was gone, the memories of it and the souls would live on within them. As Halloween approached, they felt not fear but vigilance. The stories of the skull would forever be a part of them, a painful memory, but also a lesson in courage and compassion. The skull was no more, but the souls had been freed, and they would live in the freedom they deserved.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. I really appreciate your time and hope to see you in the next video. Take care, and see you soon.